Hello, Kevin.
Aye.
Hi. Really good to have you on the podcast. The reason I want to speak to you is because we briefly spoke at the recent Battle of Ideas, and also I was part of the audience of your panel, which was to do with assisted dying, which I want to get to amongst the weeds of that. But before we begin with that conversation, I just want to get to know you, the audience, to get to know you, basically who you are and your journey up until this point.
Right. Well, I am emeritus professor of history at the University of Sunderland. Emeritus is basically just means I've retired and they don't pay me anymore, but I keep the title. So
Okay.
that's basically it. I just retired very recently, and I have been interested in this issue of assisted suicide, stroke assisted dying. I call it assisted suicide. Others prefer to call it assisted dying. I've been interested in this since I first wrote an article in 1996 about this. So I've been talking about it for a long time. What brought me to it in the very beginning was the suicide of a friend when I was quite young, when I was 18. And I was growing up in Canada, and he disappeared off to an American city. And it turned out he had bought a gun and shot himself in a hotel room. And so it was when you're 18, that kind of thing has a great effect on you. And what happened was we all went out and and drank coffee and then whiskey and just why did he do it? What could we have done, etc., etc. I worked with his father, so it utterly destroyed his family. And I just remember thinking, no, suicide is a bad act. It's generally a bad thing. There are good suicides, but mostly I think we want to prevent them. And that gave me my perspective on this issue when it came up in the 90s.
Okay. Okay. So obviously during the debate, one of the things we talked about assistant dying in this country because the government's looking to possibly introduce a law. Although since that debate, I know that well, it's been reported in various news outlets that certain MPs, I think it's up to 100, have actually said, actually, we need to have a look at this, including the health secretary, by the way. So it might be a chance it might actually not go through, although it's still in favour of going through. Um, but obviously, I first heard about this subject when it talks about Canada and the Netherlands. So, if you don't mind, just a brief history of the law in Canada, like what prompted it to be introduced and how has it developed since then?
Yes, in Canada, it began as a court case in British Columbia. It was called the Carter case, and that came about in 2015, I believe, or I can't remember whether it came out in 2015 or 2016. But what that court case did, it concerned a woman who was desperately ill from motor neuron disease and wanted the right to die. Cases had come up before, of course. This is something that the other side only needs to win once. We need to win every time the debate comes up. And Carter basically ordered the government to give the right to die because the judge had decided that it was within what's called the Canadian Charter of Rights, which is a sort of equivalent of the American Constitution. So it's got a Charter of Rights. Now, the government didn't actually have to do that and didn't have to get involved. It didn't have to legislate because there is a clause in the charter that says the government can invoke what's called the notwithstanding clause and get rid of it. But they decided not to, and they passed legislation which allowed it from 2016. And it was allowed originally, despite the fact that motor neuron disease, it wasn't mentioned in the Carter case, it was allowed in leg excuse me, in legislation for people who with what was called a reasonably foreseeable death. So it was only for the terminally ill. But in 2020, they changed that. It came into force in 2021, which said that people with a a condition, a permanent condition, which is de facto all disabled people. And that came in 2021. And they're going to increase it further to people with mental illnesses from 2027. And that's already gone through, so it's going to happen. But they have staved it off once because basically it's very unpopular. It may be that they think it'll grow in popularity later. This is, of course, shall I explain the other countries where it's legal?
Yeah, I mean, the Netherlands is obviously the most prominent one in Europe. So yeah, if you explain that as well, please.
Yeah, it's legal in the Netherlands and Belgium from 2002 in the Netherlands and 2003 in Belgium. And it's Belgium is different because it's euthanasia only. Whereas in Canada, it's euthanasia and assisted suicide. Euthanasia, where the doctor gives the deadly dose, and assisted suicide, where the patient actually gives themselves the deadly dose. So in the Netherlands, both are legal. In Canada, both are legal. But in Belgium, only euthanasia, where the doctor gives the deadly dose, is allowed. So what we've seen in these areas is that it was fairly unrestricted at first because the way the Netherlands operates, it's about whether medics think it's appropriate treatment for unbearable suffering. So it's really the decision of the doctors. And what they have an obligation to do is have any reasonable treatment already they have to have gone through the other treatment. They have to exhaust the treatment options. So it's not a right at all in the Netherlands. It's very much a doctor's decision. That's much more the case in Belgium as well. Whereas in Canada, it's much more on a rights basis because of the Carter decision. So therefore, it's people have the right to this treatment. So therefore, what you can do in Canada is, of course, doctor shop. And this has resulted in a recent case of a 27-year-old autistic woman who tried 3 times. And the first time, one doctor said yes, one doctor said no. The second time, both doctors said, I think the second time the same thing happened. And then the third time, finally, 2 doctors said yes. But that's because she had got the doctor from the first question to say the one that was positive in the first one joined the other one that was positive. So they just put together this assembly of doctors who said she could have the euthanasia. Then her father said, hold on, can I get a stay on this? Because I don't think there's anything medically wrong with her. She's got autism, but I don't know of any treatment, and she lives with us, with my wife and I. So it was a court case about this. And of course, what happened was this woman had the right. So she was able to, I still think it's actually going through the courts, but it was a horrendous case. And in Canada, of course, if it's your right, then all a doctor has to say is this person has this disease and this can cause suffering. And once you've got that certificate, you can go and get it.
So what safeguards are in place for people who like that? Do they have to have tried different treatments and different types of care before they're allowed to go through this procedure? Or is it just, yeah, I feel like doing it, so I just can have it done, please?
Well, the safeguards in Canada are meant to be that you have to be unbearably suffering. You have to put a written request in. The doctor has to give a note saying that this person suffers from this condition or this disease, but that's it. So, for instance, in Canada, there are examples of people who have gone, and requested a euthanasia and then said the reason that they wanted the euthanasia is because they were homeless, even though they actually sort of they qualified in other ways, if you see what I mean. They already met the criteria, but they admitted that it was really about being homeless. And of course, that throws up all sorts of questions. But the Canadian model is really rights based. And that's where I think the British legislation would also be heading. But we shall have to see because we haven't seen the bill that's been put in yet. So there's no way of actually asking about it. One thing about the Scottish bill, though, which is similar, is that although it's supposed to, the Scottish bill was supposed to be for those who are terminally ill only, its definition of terminal illness included diabetes type 1, anorexia nervosa, certain types of arthritis. So it said it's got a clause, I think it's even just clause 2, that says this is, for the purposes of this legislation, terminally ill means the following: a permanent condition that's likely to shorten life. That's a very, very broad thing, and it's much closer to what Canada has than what, for instance, the states in the USA, where it's legalized, that's much more restrictive.
Unbearably suffering seems a very broad term. I mean, as you were talking there, I was thinking, well, you could have someone who's been married for so long and then their husband or wife dies and you're unbearably suffering from that. Imagine under Canadian law, that could be as weird as it sounds, could be a viable reason why you'll be allowed to go for procedure because you're suffering from heartache, which sounds silly, but that's how vague the term seems to be.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's happened in Switzerland, because in Switzerland they have um, no sort of, basically in Switzerland it's legal to assist any suicide so long as the motivation is not financial or it's not selfish. So there have been cases where, for instance, a couple go because one is imminently dying and the other does not want to live after that. Not very many, but that's also a thing in the Netherlands. There are many couple euthanasias, and the chances of both being terminally ill in the same way are fairly low. But there was, I can't remember, I think it was something like 80 couples euthanasias in the Netherlands. So I think this is the problem, is that unbearably suffering is a very difficult term. First of all, what does unbearably suffering mean? If it was unbearable, you wouldn't bear it. So it's a bit of a nonsense term in the first place. But also, all human suffering is in context. So, for instance, people don't suffer from pain and ask for euthanasia necessarily. Um, Pain isn't in the top 5 reasons why people in Oregon choose assisted suicide, more accurately. Pain isn't in the top 3 reasons why Canadians choose it, or it might be the third reason, but it's not the top reason. Pain, and that includes pain and concern about pain. Pain can generally be dealt with, but existential pain can't be dealt with. And that makes sense if you think about it. If I asked you, would you rather have a punch in the face right now or a year of suffering and agony over, emotional agony, say, when somebody breaks up? You would take the punch in the face. Anybody would, because it's over with very quickly. So, and yet, so what I'm trying to say is that pain is very much in context. If you go running, you experience pain. Generally, I do fairly quickly these days, but I know when I'm getting my second win and I feel terrible, but I know because I will get my second win, that pain is in context. Whereas I think, yes, existential pain, you can't really put into context. And that's why many people are going for this option. In fact, I would argue that almost all people are killing themselves to avoid a terrible life rather than a terrible death.
Yeah, isn't, and this is just a fear I've heard other people use the word selfish. In Switzerland, you can't do it if it's, but isn't the nature of suicide, and it's one of or assistant dying, selfish in certain way because you're just thinking about yourself at that time. I want to end my suffering. You almost no, you don't care, but you almost want to end your suffering. You're not thinking of the impact your death has. That's not my. That's something that I've heard someone else say.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit harsh, to be absolutely honest. I think people are genuinely really, they're in terrible circumstances and they're facing a pretty awful death sometimes with some of them, and really awful prospects. But I have some sympathy for what you say, in the sense that, I have attended deaths where I thought actually it'd be better if this person was their life was ending now. There are situations like that. I'm not against assisted suicide in all circumstances. I think in some circumstances it might be an all right thing. But what I'm against is a change in the law, because I think that's what really is threatened by this. It's our moral inclination about preventing suicides that will actually be really threatened. So I think that's the way to look at it. It's not that they're being selfish, but it's that well, if I look at Esther Ranson, she's demanding a change in the law because of her circumstances. I think that's a little bit self-centered. Um, just because uh, you want a bespoke death, so to speak, or you want to die on your birthday, you think the law should be changed. I don't think people can demand change like that. And I suspect, actually, and you heard it here first, that Esther Ranson will die a natural death. That's my prediction. But I'm a little bit sympathetic to what you say, because I think it's people trying to change law and morality on the basis of their own personal suffering, and I think that there is a sort of element of projecting yourself onto everything else. If they just asked for it and said quietly, just then I'd be a bit more sympathetic.
How, in regards to palliative care and adult care in general? Well, actually, no. Before we get onto that, what's the age limit that you can undertake this? What's the minimum age?
In I
Canada.
think virtually everywhere, well, it depends where you are. In Canada, it's 18. So you need to, 18, any competent adult age 18 is allowed. But now they're just introducing something in Quebec, which means that you no longer have to be competent at the time. You can do an advance directive. So that will change. But in the Netherlands, they've extended to all children in 2023. And in 2014, Belgium extended it to children from the age of 8. So the whole thing about autonomy goes out the window fairly quickly, because a child cannot make an autonomous decision about their body like that. They can't in law in other ways. For instance, the age of consent for sex is 16. So it doesn't make any sense to have it lower than 16. But in Belgium and the Netherlands, it is. And in some ways that makes sense, because if you think of it as medical treatment for unbearable suffering, how can you turn away people? How can you say, oh, no, sorry, you don't qualify for this medical treatment, even though you're suffering unbearably? So, you know, that's the way people look at it. I think it's quite dangerous, though, because if you project suffering on other people, you know, I might think you're suffering, and
Yeah,
you might have a different idea than I do
yeah,
about that. Many disabled people say, oh, people come up to them and say, oh, I'd rather be dead than like you. And of course, they lead, very fulfilling lives and are very happy. Thank you.
yeah. That seems odd. I mean, what age 8 in Belgium? I mean, that's just
It's
bizarre.
it's very, very rare, I should emphasize. It has happened, though. In Belgium, they have euthanized children very young age. They have to have the permission of the parents. The child has to have expressed it, but I still think it's very insidious.
Yeah, especially with children, like mental capacity hasn't formed yet. I mean, and also, what parent would want to go through that? Um, and also, just quickly, this made me think of another question. If How much pressure have doctors put on places like Canada and the Netherlands and Belgium? Is it just a case of the doctors don't put any pressure on, or have there been cases where doctors have actually put pressure on them to carry out this procedure?
I don't think they've put pressure, because they have to be very, very careful, doctors, because of course it's not legal for them to put pressure. However, what happens when you legalize this, it means that it's medical treatment. So therefore, if you are a good doctor, you have to say, here are the treatment options. One, two, three, four. And if you are in Canada, one of the treatment options is euthanasia. So there's a very good example of a woman who was having her second mastectomy. And she said it both times. A doctor said, "You are aware that you have the possibility of having euthanasia." And that, of course, you know, who knows whether that's pressure? I listen to my doctor. So if my doctor says, "Well, I think if I were you, I would do X, Y, and Z," I think, okay, he's the doctor. He knows I need to listen to the doctor. So I think even by listing them as treatment options, then doctors will be pushing people down particular paths. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And it's happened in Canada where, there's a woman who requested a wheelchair ramp, and somebody came back and said, "Well, did you know about euthanasia? Because I don't think we're going to get the wheelchair ramp." So those kind of things have happened.
Well, this leads on to the next point is, have other parts of care in these countries improved as a result? Have they tried to make them more robust so that going through assisted dying or euthanasia is more or less like a last resort?
No, what happens is almost the opposite. They pass it on the basis of terminal illness. And then people say, "Well, hold on a second, I have 7 months to live." And you're saying, "I don't qualify for this, but I'm going to, suffer for a longer period of time." And there are already people who think it should be extended long, far beyond assisted, like suicide, for those with 6 months or less to live. So they pick up on it and they push these cases. And of course, it makes sense. If somebody's suffering from a long-term condition and they want to die, why can't they have this magical medical treatment that solves all problems? So it extends there. And the other trouble is that people don't really pay attention. So, for instance, a friend of mine in Belgium, he said when it first passed in Belgium, he thought, "Oh, good, because we're, in a very advanced nation, and look, we're leading the world in this." But he didn't pay any attention to it. The only thing that made him pay attention to it is when he got an email saying, "Can you collect your mother's good, stuff, because she's been given euthanasia." And he got that, and she was 58, and she was mentally ill, and he knew he had been estranged from her because there was some difficulty between them over 2 or 3 months previously, but he did not know that she was going to euthanize herself. And he said, "This is when it suddenly dawned on me how evil this law is, because it robs people of loved ones. It can do that. And plus, because it's private medicine, nobody finds out about it. So if you go to the doctor and you ask for X, Y, and Z, I can never find out what that relationship is. Doctor's not allowed to tell other people. So it makes the records very, very difficult to actually follow. So there are no adequate records where it's legal because A, you're not allowed to call it suicide. So even though it's somebody in, Oregon taking, or California or wherever it's legal in the US, even though it's somebody taking deadly drugs that have been given to them by a doctor, they're not allowed to record it as suicide. It's recorded as whatever the underlying disease is, which of course is not good records either, because you need to know how many people in a year die of this disease and etc. So it tends to have the opposite effect, that they sort of get it passed on basis of robust safeguards, 6 months to live, and then it expands.
So, what safeguards? I might ask this question before, but what safeguards are there for people who have some sort of learning difficulty or learning difficulty? Because I don't hear any from what you're saying.
I mean, it's very much up to the doctor in some ways. So I know of at least 9 cases of people suffering only from autism in the Netherlands that have been granted euthanasia. I know of 60 cases of women, and they're all women, most of them young women, under the age of 40, who have been given euthanasia for what's called terminal anorexia. So these kind of things are already happening, and people should be up in arms about them, but it tends to be very quiet because unless you were their relative, or unless they were your friend, and whatever, even if you are their relative, it's very difficult for you to find out exactly what happened on, to your loved one because their medical records are private.
We've talked about Canada and the Netherlands and Belgium have introduced this law. Have there been any other countries? I know the UK is looking to do it, but have there been any other countries who have looked to introduce it and then thought, actually, you know what, we don't actually like this, and they've stepped back from it?
Well, there have been more than 250 attempts in the United States to legalize it, and none have been success. There are 10 states and one and Washington, D.C., which isn't a state, that have legalized it. But there, in all of the other states, there have been attempts at bills. They keep on batting, they keep on going in there, but there's been nothing over the past 3 and a bit years that's passed in the United States. So it's not like gay marriage where it sort of goes like wildfire and just passes and everybody goes, yeah, gay marriage. Yeah, that's it. It's something that a lot of people contest, and I've been contesting it for a long time. And I can tell you, you don't need that many voices to actually just say, hold on a second. Because I think it's one of those things that if you speak to people long enough about it, they go, you've given me some questions at least. That's my aim in life. It's just to throw spanners in the works of these things. And, I think the more you resist these kind of things, the more people are actually, this is why we're quite hopeful about what's going to happen on the 29th of November, because we're just able to talk to people and say, do you realize this is what this means? And most people go, no, all that they think of is that emotional scene at the bedside, where, oh, grandma's suffering, but nobody can do anything. And it's almost like look to camera. It's not a very real situation, but it makes for great drama. It's been in all the soaps, it's in many films, great dramatic thing, but it doesn't really happen. Most people die peaceful deaths. And even where it's legal, like in the Netherlands, they have between 28.5 and 42.8% of deaths are still they're either suffering pain or they are disturbed in some way, in a way that symptoms that they don't want to have happen in death. And that's where it's been legal. Euthanasia has been legal for what, nearly 20 something years now. So it just doesn't really solve the problem that it's trying to solve. We all want people to have a peaceful death, but you know, nobody's going to say, no, I want an unpeaceful death. But what people don't realize is that it's not really about that. It's about worries that people have. It's a bit like in that session, there's a very good question by a woman who said, it's a little bit like birth. You don't know what's going to happen. You can never imagine what's going to happen. And you imagine it in your own mind and you imagine it. And then when it happens, it's totally different than what you think. So I think it's a lot like that. I thought that was a very good point. So I don't think it's necessary from that perspective. I've slightly gone off track though, so you can bring me
Yes.
back on
Okay.
on track.
I mean, with birth, I imagine for the most part, birth is more of a joyous thing. Whereas I think the way we talk about death in general is it's even though it could be a celebration of life, especially in the Western world. I don't know if we talk about it too somberly. So I understand what that woman's saying, and I agree for the most part. But obviously, the way we talk about both life and death is completely different. Where in a way the way you talk about it as a both as celebrations of life, but we don't.
Well, yes, I think she was more making the point that the woman, like, if I don't know whether you have kids, but
No.
when you have kids, you go to these birthing classes and
Mhm.
you're told this and that and the other thing, and you do this planning. You go, oh, we're gonna have a birthing pool, and we're going to do this, and it's going to be whale noises in the background, and this and that and the other thing. It's all good. And of course, it never unfolds like that. And all of the birthing plans, so to speak, just go out the window. And it's a very messy affair. Yes, I mean, I take your point, it's joyful, but the actual birth experience is pretty traumatic, or can be. It's something to, you get a prize at the end of it, but it's not very nice, the whole other bits. So I think she was making the point that you have it in your mind what you're going to do before before birth. You have the birth plan. And then, of course, you go, give me an epidural, and that's it. It's painful and messy, and that's the problem with life. Life is painful and messy, and death is painful and messy. In my experience, it never goes. There's and there's this sort of inclination that is personified by, what's her face, that's going off to Switzerland, Esther Ranson, which is to try and control it and try and say, I want this sort of tailor-made death. And that's, of course, stupid. You will never have that. Even if you had euthanasia, yes, you can, with euthanasia, you can plan it on a particular date at a particular time on your birthday if you want. But that's just, it's still going to, you're just cutting off weeks or perhaps months of your life. That's what you're doing, just for the sake of neatness. And I don't think that's a good thing.
Are there any particular groups that are for and against this procedure?
Yes, you have in this country, Dignity in Dying is perhaps the most prominent organization that's campaigning for changing the law. They began in the 1930s as a voluntary euthanasia legislation society, and then as voluntary euthanasia society. And the other prominent group was the Euthanasia Society of America, and they were both sort of cooperating with each other, and they were connected with a lot of people who were interested in eugenics. In fact, one person that headed up the Eugenics Society also headed up the original Dignity in Dying. So you've had that organization has been going a very long time in this country. You also have the Humanists, and their sort of sponsorship. The Humanists were also pro-eugenics and pro-euthanasia during this period of time. Many prominent people were. It's a very posh thing back in the 1930s when it began. It was very prominent members of society. And the Humanists continued to campaign, but they campaigned for not just 6 months to die. They want it extended to all people with medical conditions that make them suffer unbearably. So it's a much broader thing that the Humanists want. Those are the two organizations against or for. The organizations against care not killing is probably the most prominent. I work for them for care not killing. They are a sort of an organization made up of religious groups and non-religious groups, and not just Christian religious groups. There's also the British Islamic Medical Association as part of Care Not Killing. There are also the other prominent people who are against is an organization called Not Dead Yet, which is there's Not Dead USA and Not Dead Britain and Not Dead Australia and various different other places. And all of those organizations are full of disabled people who are very concerned that, in fact, society will be divided between unequal groups of people. Some people who we say, oh, we will try and strenuously prevent your suicides from happening. And the other set of people who, if you ever find yourself on a cliff edge, we'll give you a push if you like, which includes, of course, disabled people. So all major disabled organizations, except for those ones set up by Dignity in Dying to try and fool people, are against assisted suicide.
So coming to the UK, obviously you've not had the bill yet. I think it was in next month that's due to come out.
Yes, it's you've had the first reading of the bill, but we don't know what's actually in it. The first reading only has, and that was on October the 16th, that only has the title of the bill. Whereas because it's a private member's bill, they don't actually have to even put it out except I think 48 hours before it's debated on the Friday. So I think that's the bill we haven't seen yet. We have seen consecutive bills, but I did have a friend who spoke to Kim Leadbeater today and asked her whether the bill was going to be just like Charlie Faulkner's bill in the House of Lords, which he put in at the beginning of the summer, and then, but I think he's withdrawn because of Kim Leadbeater's bill, or he may not have withdrawn. I can't remember exactly what's happening. But we don't know what's in the bill is the key thing. So people are being asked to consider it before we actually know. And Kim Leadbeater said it's not going to be like Charles Faulkner's bill. So we have to just wait and see. The second reading is on the 29th, and that's when there is 5 hours given over to, because it's a private member's bill. This is all very archaic parliamentary stuff that I've had to learn about. They have 5 hours to debate it, but of course that's a ridiculously small amount of time because it's a very, very important subject. It's, as Kim Leadbeater says, it's hugely complex, and she has to get it right, but we haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I think um, that that seems to be why there's like, I think it's close to 100 MPs who may vote against it because, as you say, they're not getting a lot of time to read it. And I just wonder, why is the government acting like this? To me, it's a two-point issue to have a private member's bill. So I don't understand the government's motivations for it.
Well, Keir Starmer has historically been in favor of it. It's one of his something that he has been on record about, even as director of public prosecutions, which he was during the last Labour government. And he was in favor of it. And I suspect, this is just a guess, but Kim Leadbeater is fairly close to Keir Starmer. And I think he put pressure on, this is my theory, it may or may not be right, but I think he put pressure on Kim Leadbeater, or she might have been, very in favor, who knows. And so he wanted to go through quickly, but I don't understand why he does that, because I think he sort of doesn't quite understand the depth of feeling amongst many of his new MPs in particular. And it will rest on the heads of 200 new Labour MPs. So I think he is trying to put something through quickly in the hopes, because that's the best strategy for them. It's when you get bogged down in actually discussing the issue and thinking about it that people start to say, no, I don't think this is a good idea. The very best strategy is do what Canada did, involve as few people as possible, just push it through quickly without any real discussion, and then it's there on the statute books. Whereas if you start having a long debate about it, so I think that's their strategy. All we want to talk about is, oh, the sad scene at the deathbed scene. And after that, everybody shut up. So that's what I think they're trying to do. I think it'll be close, but if they fail, it will blow up in Starmer's face a little bit.
I just worry, especially the UK, because over the last 25, 30 years, if all these scandals come out, just like Hillsborough, Grenfell, the post office scandal, etc., where they involve the state and people effectively died as a result. And I'm wondering if you're going to introduce this to systems which aren't already robust anyway, the, it could be catastrophic, I could say.
Well, I mean, this is the point that West Streeting makes. I mean, West Streeting has come out against it. And he makes the point that, whatever you think of it, now is not the time for it. We've just said that the NHS is in crisis. We just said that we're not giving any more funding to the NHS. But do you really want to have euthanasia as a way of saving money on the NHS? And I think that's what most people are concerned about. And rightly so. That's the real agenda behind it. People say it's all about compassion. And I think many people are motivated by compassion. But in the end, it's very much about saving money. This is historically the two things that go with it are compassion for that person that's in the last um, little while of life and efficiency. Is it efficient to have people who use up the most resources in their last year of life, if we cut out the last, year of life, then how much resources do we save? So that goes through people's minds. There's a report in Canada by somebody from the Office of the Budget, which makes the point that you can save with the track one, and I think they underestimate this greatly, but with what's called track one, which is where people have got a reasonably foreseeable death, then the savings are about $13,400. But for the track two, for the new ones that they've introduced in 2021, and that's per person. So in track two, then it's 54,000 and something, and I can't remember exactly, per person that they'd save. And that's before their pensions, that's before housing, that's before sort of other social aspects that are being paid for, by the state. So the total savings that Canada has made since it's been in place in 2016 is got to be more than $1 billion, if you do the maths. So that's always behind it. I mean, I would never call my opponents Nazis because I think most people are very well motivated. But you can pay attention to history and you can see that in Germany in the 1930s, they advertised, and this was directly from Hitler. They had a series of films, because films were fairly new then, and it was propaganda films. And they said, do you know how much it costs for this mentally ill person? You could feed a family of four on the costs that this mentally ill person caught, by putting them up. Do you want to bear that expense? It's you that pays for it. And they did all of this stuff and they didn't get a great response. So then finally they did propaganda, the greatest propaganda film, I think, for assisted suicide and euthanasia, which is called Ich klage an, which means I accuse. It was a film made in 1941. It was all about a woman who was suffering from motor neuron disease, and she was vivacious, and then suddenly she was struck down and she begged her husband to kill her. And then finally he did, and then he went to court. So that's the whole premise of the thing. But you suddenly realize that this is what they put their money into. They didn't sort of say, guess what? These people cost a lot of money because that wasn't successful. They went in and on compassion. So it's always used, compassion is always used for another agenda by some people. As I say, I think most people are well motivated. I'm sure that Canon Rosie Harper, who was the Reverend Canon Rosie Harper, who was arguing against me in the meeting, I think she's very well motivated. I don't think she's like trying to do this to save money, but I think it will be grasped by people who do want to save money.
I just think he's got the capacity at the moment just to go horribly wrong somewhere down the line. And I think the sad thing is, if it does, it won't be 2 years later, and obviously you won't be able to reverse it. I don't know, man. I'm just, yeah.
Well, if it does go through, then it'll all quieten down and nobody will pay attention. And guess what? In all of any cases, the chief witness will be dead. You can't interview people after they're dead and saying, well, are you better off dead? Or, how did it go? How was that for you? You'll never get that. So that's the danger is they'll just quietly do it and keep it out of the limelight. And there will be just horrendous cases. I mean, we get upset rightly because I'm opposed to capital punishment, for instance. And Amnesty International goes, do you know that this guy took, X number of hours to die? And everybody goes, that's cruel and unusual punishment. That's terrible. And this guy who has been executed is pretty much a scumbag, I'm afraid. Like he's not a nice guy. He deserves, nobody's going to cry. Well, maybe his mother, but very few people are going to cry when he dies because he's such a horrendous human being. Um, uh, but still, we're upset by that, and rightly so. I don't think it's right to do that. I don't think it's right to purposefully kill a human being unless it's in self-defense or with some other very important reason that these people's lives are being taken just, in capital punishment and with assisted suicide, just simply because they're wretched. And I think that's the wrongness of it. But it's also one of the interesting things is that everybody, and the point I was trying to make is how it'll be quiet, is that the record number of hours in Oregon, which happened, I think, last year, was 137. 137 hours before that, the poison went in and they actually died. If that was a capital punishment case, we'd all be up in arms. But no, it's assisted suicide, so they agreed, so that's fine. So that's how it'll get swept under the carpet. That's the problem. If you legalize it, then it will happen in a ruthlessly efficient way and a quiet way. And it because of medical records being private and everything, we will never know exactly what's going on.
Have any doctors in Canada, Netherlands, or Belgium, or other place that's done it that you know of, actually refused to do it just based on principle?
Yes, there's a case of, I mean, one of the safeguards that they always tell us that's going to be there is that no doctor will have to participate. But in Nova Scotia, there's a group of 24 doctors, 25 doctors actually, who refused, and all of their jobs have been threatened because on the basis that this is medical care, your job is to implement medical care, and you're refusing to do this part of your job. It's not on. So in Canada, the whole idea that you can have a conscience decision not to participate has gone out the window. And I would predict that that's what will happen just about anywhere, although it has held in other areas, I have to say. But if you define it as medical treatment, how can you not provide medical treatment if you're a doctor?
Yeah, it just seems wild, this whole thing. Where he
It's
lives. Oh,
Yeah. I mean, you're saying that because you've just sort of come across this because you're a young man and you've suddenly gone, whoa, this is a bit serious. Whereas I've been looking at this for so long that nothing surprises me in some ways. You get used to the horror stories.
I think what surprises me is that there seems to be very little safeguard is probably the wrong word, but there's very little care beforehand before someone gets to that point. And actually, this brings me to another something you said about motor neurone disease as well. Has it affected treatments or trying to find better treatments for those type of chronic illnesses? Could surely be just a money saver if you went straight to the extreme version.
I don't think that would be fair. I don't think it's taken away from, for instance, research for motor neuron disease. We still want to, even if they provide it for people, I still think, the ideal that most doctors and most researchers work for is to prevent the disease from doing the damage that it does in the first place. So I think I'd give people credit for that. What it does do, or what it can do, or what people worry it will do, is affect palliative care. Palliative care is, of course, when it's at the end of life and there's not much that can be done anymore. And palliative care can be negatively affected. There's a poll, an interesting poll that's come out fairly recently, just this year in June, that showed that most British people actually worried that if it was provided, that palliative care would start going downhill, and because there's an alternative that's much cheaper.
Yeah, much cheaper, but sadly a lot more definitive than palliative care. Um,
Well, I mean, as I say, I very much think that people are trying to escape a terrible life. And what palliative care is so good at is actually providing a good death. People who are in palliative care, particularly in a hospice program, can actually have a good death.
yeah,
And you
yeah.
don't need to cut off part of your life. There's a woman who wrote on death and dying in the 1960s and 70s. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was her name. She was a pioneering author, brought up all of this issues of dying that people talk about now. And she made the point, she said, I'm against assisted suicide because you're just cutting off part of somebody's life.
Hmm.
Why would you do that? all parts of life are parts of life, and you experience them all. And why would you cut off part of the life just because you couldn't bear to see the end bit, or you wanted to organize it on a particular day? So she said we're robbing of them of part of their life, and that's wrong.
Yeah, indeed. We'll leave it there. Just very quickly, if people want to find out any articles written about this or any work you've done on this, where can I go to?
You can go to either my book, which was published a while ago now, 2013, which is called, it's just got my name, and it's the Liberal Humanist Case Against Assisted Suicide. It's called Assisted Suicide, the Liberal Humanist Case Against Legalization. Sorry, I didn't name the book, so I always forget to say. But also my many articles in Spiked I've done over the years. As I say, I just looked up, I did a 20-year revival of an article called 10 Myths About Assisted Suicide, and sadly, some of them are still being touted around.
Just quickly, what is the biggest myth about it?
I think the pain is the biggest motivation. I think people think, oh, this is about a painful death. No, it's not. It's about somebody fearing painful death, or it's about fearing other things. It's about fear in the end. So pain isn't in the top 5 reasons why people requested an organ. They fear other things. They fear not being able to do activities that they find enjoyable. They fear not being able to go to the toilet unaided. They fear things like that, rather than actually pain. Pain can be controlled pretty well. So that's for me the biggest myth.
Yeah, indeed. Kevin, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Very thought provoking. Thank you so much for coming on to the 286 Project podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.